The story shifts to a different perspective within a certain dungeon, with short, spiky dark hair and an expression of pure, arrogant triumph. In his mind, he is the protagonist of a grand, romantic epic, imagining himself surrounded by a harem of beautiful women, including an elf queen and a tsundere knight, all devoted to him. His delusions don't stop there. He envisions himself as a powerhouse in society, boasting connections to the world's most powerful wizard and the magic beast Fenrir. He speaks of his social standing being through the roof, completely lost in a fantasy of prestige and power. However, the reality is far less glamorous. The scene cuts to a confused monster, the same bull-headed guard from before, watching the young man from the sidelines. He looks on with a bewildered expression, wondering what on earth he is doing as the boy continues to shout and strike poses in the middle of the corridor. The scene returns to the comfort of the Dragon King's chamber, where Van and Ryuka are settled on the floor around a game board. Ryuka, wearing her casual white shirt and sporting a mischievous grin, introduces him to the game of reincarnation. She explains that it's a competition where players use dice to gather allies and fight, all while aiming for the strongest possible rebirth. Van, looking relaxed in his dark vest, listens intently and agrees that it sounds like fun. As he rolls the dice, he cheers with excitement, shouting out a sequence of numbers. Watching from the doorway, the bull-headed guard and a small, fluffy monster observe the pair, their expressions soft as they watch the two friends enjoy a simple, wholesome afternoon together. As the game progresses, Van seems strangely thrilled by a series of misfortunes. He laughs with delight as his character is betrayed, exiled from the party, and stripped of all his cash, explaining to a bewildered Ryuka that getting unlucky provides a powerful revenge buff in the game's mechanics. Ryuka, however, is completely appalled by the narrative. She finds the idea of betrayal and persecution a miserable way to live and doesn't understand why Van finds it appealing. Despite her distaste, she can't help but smile seeing how genuinely excited he is. Watching from the sidelines, the bull-headed guard and his companion are torn. While they are touched by how happy their dragon queen looks, they are horrified by the game's plot. When Ryuka suddenly switches into mass murder mode to avenge her character's betrayal, the bull-headed monster sighs, concluding that it is, indeed, a terrible game. While Van and Ryuka are preoccupied with their game, a group of monsters huddle nearby, critiquing the lack of romance between the two. One of them, a harpy with light-colored hair and feathered wings, is particularly dissatisfied, noting that for two 17-year-olds, there is absolutely no sexiness to their interaction. The harpy introduces herself as a siren, explaining that her songs have the mystical ability to beguile anyone who hears them by drawing out their deepest, hidden desires. Though she admits she's never actually tried it on them, she is determined to intervene. With a mischievous glint in her eye, the harpy decides it's time to take matters into her own hands. As she prepares to sing, she looks toward Van and Ryuka, plotting to use her siren song to finally put them in the mood and push their relationship forward. The siren's song takes hold instantly, weaving a spell of sudden, intense longing over the pair. Ryuka's expression shifts to one of dazed desire, her cheeks flushing as she looks at Van, admitting that looking at him is making her feel hot. Van is equally affected, his eyes wide and breath shallow as he tells her that he feels strange. Driven by the artificial impulse, Ryuka leans in close, her voice a breathless whisper as she tells Van that her chest feels tight and begs him to quell the feeling. The tension peaks as they move toward one another, their faces only inches apart. Watching from the wings, the siren is completely thrilled by her own success. She grins wildly, her eyes wide with excitement as she admits that the sheer delusion of the moment almost gave her a nosebleed. Beside her, the bull-headed guard and the small, fluffy creature look on in a mixture of shock and anxiety, terrified by how dangerous the situation has become. Just as it seems they are about to kiss, Ryuka suddenly lunges forward, shouting Van's name in a burst of chaotic energy. The siren's plan is interrupted by Wulkun, a fluffy white kobold with a concerned expression. He steps forward, arguing that forcing the two into a lewd situation isn't the right kind of progress and could potentially ruin their precious friendship. Wulkun reflects on the simple beauty of their current relationship, imagining Van and Ryuka walking side by side in a peaceful, bittersweet moment. He admits that he wants to cherish these days of innocent flirting rather than rushing them into something artificial. The bull-headed guard agrees, noting that if they were to peek on the pair while they were inflamed, they would be failures as minions. Even the siren has to concede that the kobold makes a good point. Though tempted, she decides to hold back on the chaos for now, leaving Van and Ryuka to their own pace. Wulkun remains determined, his wide eyes filled with a sincere, almost religious devotion to the couple's happiness. He believes that there are 10 years of deep feelings between Van and Ryuka, and he declares that even if it requires force, he wants to ensure the Dragon Queen finds true happiness. The kobold's idealism is a stark contrast to the siren's more hedonistic goals. He tells the other monsters that while he isn't a fan of lewdness, he can't stand by and watch if the situation is handled poorly. Feeling that he's said his piece, Wulkun turns to leave the scene. He lets out a small, eager laugh, admitting that he still really wants to see an inflamed scene full of passion. He scolds the siren for letting her own desires get in the way, insisting that the priority should be the Dragon Queen's happiness, even as he clearly hopes to enjoy the show. Ultimately, the group reaches a tentative agreement to see how things unfold. The siren reveals her secret weapon, a large acoustic guitar. The bull-headed guard is immediately skeptical, questioning why she's opted for such a mundane instrument, while another monster expresses a sudden, deep worry about the outcome. The siren, however, remains confident, warning them to plug their ears because she doesn't want any roses to grow, a vague, ominous warning about the power of her performance. With a determined look, she strikes the strings and begins to play. However, the sound that erupts is far from romantic. It is a jarring, discordant noise that physically recoils those nearby. Van, standing right in the line of fire, winces with a pained expression, letting out a miserable groan. The monster beside him looks on in sheer disbelief, wondering how this chaotic racket is possibly supposed to get anyone in the mood for romance. The discordant music creates a strange, disorienting effect on Van and Ryuka. Both of them clutch their heads, their eyes glazed over as they complain that the world is spinning around them. The monsters watching from the side are baffled, but the siren is ecstatic, convinced that their disorientation is actually a sign that her spell is working. In a sudden burst of confused passion, Van reaches out and shouts Ryuka's name, his face flushed and desperate. Ryuka, equally dazed and breathless, looks up at him with wide, shimmering eyes, barely managing to whisper his name in return. The two of them lean in, their gazes locked in an intense, hypnotic stare. As they drift closer and closer, the monsters watch with bated breath, their faces twisted in anticipation. For a moment, it seems the chaotic noise has finally pushed them over the edge, bringing them to the brink of a long-awaited confession. The romantic tension is shattered by a sudden, ear-splitting shriek that echoes through the chamber. Van and Ryuka both recoil, their faces contorted in pain as they are blasted by a wall of sonic noise. Van looks completely miserable, wondering aloud what on earth the harpy has been doing, as the sound is absolutely awful. Ryuka, her expression a mix of shock and irritation, wonders if the creature is simply practicing her singing. As the noise continues to rattle them, Van recalls that while he hasn't heard one in a while, a real harpy's screech is truly incredible in its intensity. Though incredible is certainly not a compliment in this case. The focus shifts back to the harpy, who looks entirely oblivious to the agony she's causing, her eyes wide and vacant as she continues her performance. The narration explains that in this world, half-human, half-bird creatures are generally split into two distinct categories, hinting that the siren's current, musical, approach might be more rooted in biology than actual talent. The story clarifies the distinction between the two avian types. Sirens are beautiful beings with voices that can drive people to madness with desire, while harpies are horrifying creatures, scavenger birds that search for dead meat. To the group's horror, the siren reveals her true identity with a blank expression, admitting that she is, in fact, just a harpy. Van and Ryuka look on in disbelief, pointing out that her name is literally Harpy, making her mistake entirely obvious. Even the other monsters are exasperated. The bull-headed guard bluntly calls her a moron for the failed attempt, while his companion suggests they just give up on the romantic sabotage for now. Despite the failure, Harpy refuses to quit, her eyes burning with stubborn determination. However, the mood shifts as Van and Ryuka notice the group lingering. With a look of mild confusion, Van asks them what they are doing, causing the monsters to jump in surprise as they are caught red-handed in their eavesdropping. Ryuka's patience finally snaps. Her face twists into a mask of fury as she realizes her subordinates have been spying on her most intimate moments, shouting at them for being total idiots. The atmosphere in the chamber shifts instantly from comedic to lethal. As Ryuka's anger peaks, her arm transforms into a massive, scaly dragon claw, digging into the stone floor with enough force to crack the ground. The monsters are paralyzed with fear, sensing an unprecedented level of murderous intent radiating from their leader as she declares that they are all dead. Van, ever the calming influence, looks on with a deadpan expression. He casually asks Ryuka to go easy on them, though the monsters are already trembling in terror, knowing that the Dragon Queen's wrath is not something to be taken lightly. Van breaks the tension with a bright, genuine smile, casually inviting the group to stop spying and just join in on their game instead. He suggests that the more people playing, the merrier it will be, leaving the monsters completely stunned by his kindness. Ryuka, though still looking a bit grumpy and blushing, gives a reluctant shrug and agrees to let them join. As the monsters gather around, they can't help but whisper among themselves, once again captivated by how well Van and Ryuka get along. The bull-headed guard and the others hesitate for a moment, questioning if it's really all right to intrude on the pair's private time, but their excitement quickly wins over. The group's modesty vanishes as they start pushing each other forward, eager to get into the game. In their excitement, they accidentally crowd into Ryuka's personal space. Startled and feeling cornered by the sudden surge of monsters, Ryuka lets out a shocked cry, her eyes wide as the chaotic energy of the dungeon's residents completely takes over the room. The game continues with Harpy taking her turn, though she is visibly flustered by the proximity of the others. As she reads the game prompt, which involves being reborn as a villain's daughter cast away to a goblin island, she can't help but find the scenario a bit excessive. Ryuka is practically squished between Van and the hulking monsters, her face turning a deep red as she demands they wipe the smug grins off their faces. She complains that there are far too many people crowded around, making her feel trapped. Van, for his part, remains largely unfazed, though he does mention that his shoulder is digging into her. Ryuka looks away, her expression softening into a shy, reluctant acceptance as she admits that it's probably fine. Watching from the side, the bull-headed guard and the other monsters beam with satisfaction, silently agreeing that the wholesomeness of the moment is truly the best part of the day. As a final comedic beat, the bull-headed minotaur loses himself in the game of reincarnation, striking a triumphant pose with a roar of excitement. He enthusiastically reads out his imaginary scenario, imagining himself reborn as an ugly minotaur who undergoes rigorous training to become a handsome heartthrob, beloved by both humans and monsters while living a slow life of slaying heroes and demons. Van and the others watch him with varying expressions of disbelief and amusement, noting that the brute is really getting into the spirit of the game, while the other monsters simply stare at their companion's sudden and intense commitment to his fantasy. If you like the story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe so that I can keep bringing more such stories for you to enjoy. As the day comes to an end, Ryuka hands Van a book, highly recommending it to him. She warns him with a playful, knowing look that she'll lend him up to the 9th volume because she knows once he starts, he won't be able to stop and will come crying to her for the next installment. Van laughs nervously, admitting that her predictiveness is actually kind of scary. Still clinging to her bossy persona, Ryuka tells him he'd better read them. Van gives her a cheerful wave, telling her he hears her and promising to see her tomorrow. He turns to leave, the casual intimacy of their farewell highlighting the strength of their bond. Watching from the shadows, the monsters are once again swept up in the romance of the moment. The bull-headed guard and his companions gaze at Ryuka with soft, dreamy expressions, sighing over the beauty of another precious day spent together. Ryuka, however, remains oblivious to their adoration, simply looking on with a neutral expression as her friend departs. The mood shifts as Ryuka suddenly freezes, a look of intense anxiety crossing her face. She clutches her chest, her breath coming in short gasps as a wave of sudden worry washes over her. "What all of a sudden?" she exclaims, her voice laced with panic. Behind her, the bull-headed guard and the other monsters peek around a stone archway, their expressions mirroring her confusion as they watch their leader spiral into an unexpected state of distress. Ryuka is suddenly plagued by doubt, her expression shifting to one of deep worry. She frets over whether she pushed too hard by lending Van so many books at once, wondering if he'll find her overbearing or if he'll even bother to read them. Her subordinates watch the display with pure adoration, calling her delicate and cute for caring so much. The bull-headed guard and the other monsters can't help but tease her, suggesting that if she's this worried, she should just get married and spend every waking moment by his side. The suggestion sends Ryuka into a full-blown panic. She clutches her head, overwhelmed by her own anxieties, while the others giggle at her reaction. Seeing her in such a state, Bee steps forward with a confident glint in her eye, claiming she has something that might actually be of help. Bee reveals her latest invention with a proud flourish, a magical witchcraft monitor. It looks like a modern computer screen, featuring what she describes as a 32-inch organic EL display, which she admits she cobbled together from various parts scavenged from the dungeon. The bull-headed guard explains that it was created by Orkun, the monster in charge of the dungeon's traps. The device is essentially a high-tech crystal ball that can track and display Van's movements in real time without him ever knowing he's being watched. It can even record everything it sees. Ryuka stares at the screen, where a clear image of Van is already visible. Despite the temptation to keep an eye on him, she crosses her arms and looks away with a conflicted expression. She admits that she doesn't really like the idea of peeping on someone like that, claiming she isn't as twisted as the rest of her subordinates. Despite her protests, Ryuka finds herself unable to resist the temptation. Now dressed in a comfortable, oversized white nightgown, she sits hunched over the monitor in the dim light of the dungeon, her eyes glued to the screen. The display shows Van in his room, lit by the soft glow of a lamp. He is focused and quiet, deeply engrossed in reading the book Ryuka lent him. Watching him in such a peaceful, private moment makes Ryuka's heart flutter, and she can't help but lean in closer, mesmerized. As Van lets out a tired yawn and closes the book, announcing that he's finished, Ryuka's expression turns completely smitten. With a visible blush on her cheeks and her heart thumping in her chest, she finds herself completely captivated by the simple sight of her childhood friend. As Van finishes the book, he lets out a contented sigh, admitting that Ryuka has excellent taste in literature. Realizing how late it has become, he decides to head to bed, completely unaware that he is being watched. The next day, the monsters gather around the monitor, satisfied that the Dragon Queen has no reason to worry since Van enjoyed the story. They praise Orkun for the effectiveness of the device, while Van arrives for his daily visit, beaming as he tells Ryuka he intends to dive into the next book today. Before they head off to shoot some hoops on one of the upper floors, Ryuka makes a request of her own. With a mischievous glint in her eye, she tells the others she wants a turn using the monitor herself. The bull-headed guard, however, isn't fooled by her innocent act. He bluntly calls her out, suggesting she just wants to use the device to peep on Van while he's bathing. Ryuka doesn't even bother to deny it, simply nodding with a blush and a dreamy expression, confirming the guard's suspicion. Ryuka doesn't waste a single second. She practically lunges across the room, sliding into position in front of the monitor with a focused, predatory intensity. With a small, mischievous giggle to herself, she settles in to watch Van's private life unfold on the screen. The monitor captures Van in a variety of mundane moments, such as humming a little tune to himself while going about his day. Ryuka watches with a dazed, smitten expression, completely enthralled by every little detail of his routine. Fast forward 3 days, and Ryuka has become practically addicted to the monitor. She spends her time meticulously observing Van's habits, including his diet. As she watches him eat a meal consisting entirely of vegetables, her expression turns to one of genuine concern and disapproval, urging him through the screen to eat some meat for once. Ryuka's obsession reaches a peak as she stares at the monitor with heavy, glazed eyes, completely entranced by the image of Van eating his lunch. She has become utterly consumed by the habit, her focus narrowed down to every single movement the boy makes on the screen. The bull-headed guard and the other monsters catch her in the act, staring at her in absolute horror. They can't believe that their dignified leader has devolved into such a complete stalker, spending her days spying on Van's every move. Panic-stricken and exposed, Ryuka snaps out of her trance. Her face flushes with embarrassment as she screams at her subordinates to get out, desperately trying to hide her shameful hobby and regain some shred of her royal dignity. While Ryuka is in a state of panic, Her subordinates reflect on her behavior with a mix of pity and bewilderment. They acknowledge that she's always been extreme when something bothers her, but her obsession with Van's personal life has reached a new level. Ryuka explains her reasoning, or lack thereof, admitting she suspected Van might be hiding a new girlfriend or talking about her in his sleep, which drove her to watch him for 3 days straight. The bull-headed guard points out that regardless of her motivations, Van looks genuinely depressed on the screen. Ryuka, however, completely misinterprets his expression. She convinces herself that he's just exhausted from staying up late to read the books she lent him, describing his face as sullen. The other monsters can't stand her delusion any longer. With a deadpan expression, one of them suggests that instead of staring at the monitor, Ryuka should turn it off and take a good look in the mirror to see how she's acting. The scene shifts to the bustling town outside the dungeon, where Van is approached by a group of guild adventurers. A cheerful man in plate armor and a towering knight in full gear stop him, noticing his glum expression and asking why he looks so down. Van explains his worries with a troubled look, revealing that his childhood friend, referring to Ryuka, has been feeling down lately. He mentions that when he saw her yesterday, she had noticeable bags under her eyes, and he fears she isn't getting enough sleep. The adventurers are quickly distracted, their conversation shifting from sympathy to curiosity. One of them asks if this childhood friend is a girl. As they press him for more details, the nearby monsters, who are clearly still spying on him, can't help but chime in from the sidelines, teasingly calling him Vangkun and laughing at how overly worried he is for the Dragon Queen. The guild members are completely floored by the revelation. One of them stares at Van in disbelief, questioning what is wrong with this guy, while another is practically in shock that opposite-sex childhood friends actually exist outside of fantasies. Overwhelmed by a sudden surge of envy, the adventurer leans in aggressively, begging Van to let him meet this mysterious girl. He can't believe his luck that such a real-life childhood friend is even possible and insists that he can't let this opportunity pass. The moment is abruptly crashed by the bull-headed guard, who lunges forward with a face twisted in pure rage. He screams at the adventurer, calling him scum and a playboy, swearing that he'll beat the living daylights out of him if he ever dares to get near the Lady Dragon Queen. As the guard fumes in a blind, protective frenzy, the other monsters frantically try to pull him back, desperately pleading with him to dial it down a notch. Van steps in to settle the dispute, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. With a sheepish but firm expression, he apologizes to the guild members and tells them flatly that he won't let them meet Ryuka. The rejected adventurer is devastated, whining that even a quick glimpse would be enough. He begins to lament his own misfortune, calling Van a lucky man and mourning his own lack of success with women. Meanwhile, the bull-headed guard is still in a state of absolute frenzy, roaring his support for Van and encouraging him to shut the other man down. His fellow monsters are struggling to hold him back, desperately urging him to pipe down before he causes a scene. Van explains his reasoning with a serious expression, firmly stating that there is simply no way he could bring strangers down to the bottom floor of the dungeon. He insists that he can handle things on his own, effectively shutting down the adventurer's requests. The bull-headed guard is practically bursting with pride, praising Van for protecting the Lady Dragon Queen from those evil fellows. Ryuka, however, is left with a conflicted, slightly flustered expression, feeling a mix of gratitude and awkwardness at the intensity of the situation. As things calm down, the monsters turn their attention back to the magical monitor. The knight in full armor points out that instead of worrying and spying from a distance, Ryuka should just talk to Van directly to clear the air. Ryuka looks at the screen, her gaze softening as she realizes they're right. With a determined nod, she admits that stopping the snooping and simply talking to him would be for the best. Ryuka is in full denial, shouting at her subordinates that she wasn't stalking Van, but was simply a little curious. Her companions aren't buying it for a second, bluntly telling her that she absolutely was stalking him, though they are just relieved the Dragon Queen didn't fully cross the line into obsession. Back in the town, Van suddenly stops in his tracks. A look of intense focus crosses his face as he looks directly toward the hidden camera, a sharp, knowing expression in his eyes as he lets out a thoughtful hem. Back in the dungeon, the monsters freeze in terror. Ryuka stares at the monitor in a panic, convinced that Van has just looked right through the screen and caught her in the act. Trembling with anxiety, she wonders if the secret of her spying has finally been exposed. Orkun, the dungeon's trap maker, frantically defends the device, explaining that it only uses a tiny amount of magical energy to transmit the images. However, the other monsters bluntly tell him that he completely underestimated Van's perception. Ryuuka is in a state of sheer panic, convinced that Van has figured it all out. She admits that lately she's been sensing his presence in a strange way, realizing with a shudder that Van has been training for so long that his senses have actually surpassed her own. As the realization sinks in, Ryuuka's expression collapses into one of pure dread. She stares blankly ahead, her eyes wide and shimmering with anxiety, terrified that her shameful secret has finally been uncovered. In a fit of sheer desperation and panic, Ryuuka decides the only way to deal with her shame is to destroy the evidence. With a furious shout of "Be sealed!" she lunges forward and smashes the magical monitor into a million pieces, her expression a chaotic mix of terror and aggression. As the dust settles, her subordinates look on with a mixture of pity and amusement. The bull-headed guard and the others find her reaction incredibly cute, while Orkun simply sighs, mourning the loss of his work of art. Ryuuka collapses into a heap, admitting she just couldn't bear the thought of Van glaring at her for being a stalker. The scene shifts as Van arrives at the dungeon for his visit. He looks at Ryuuka with a puzzled expression, questioning if she was really so worried about whether he read the books that she actually lost sleep over it. Ryuuka, now completely flustered and avoiding eye contact, tries to play it cool. She mumbles that she's also been staying up late reading, attempting to deflect the attention. Van simply blinks, a confused question mark appearing over his head as he tries to make sense of her strange behavior. If you like the story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe so that I can keep bringing more such stories for you to enjoy.